and to approach reopening very carefully.
Yeah, and I think as the weather starts to warm up here in Ontario, everyone has that idea to go out and to see family, to have a few barbecues. But yeah, definitely need to stay the course. I've got two little ones who are asking every day if they could see grandma and grandpa, but it's tough. But we know that we need to do our part to flatten the curve. But on that note, how does this thing end? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? What does our path look like moving forward?
Yeah. So let's start with the fact that there's really no path to ending a pandemic other than a vaccine, and current estimates are that that's likely to be 18 to 24 months out, and we can't talk. We can talk more about that in a second, but I think in the interim, there's a lot we can do to get this thing under control and get back to some modified new way of public life. But it's really predicated on whether we collectively take the right steps and realize that science has to lead our exit strategy. But that said, how to relax the lockdown is not something around which there's scientific consensus yet. And so it's likely that reopening society is going to be a long haul with a lot of trial and error. It's going to have to be something we take baby steps with. And that's really reflected in the kind of staged approach that we're seeing in the roadmaps being released by various localities. So here in Ontario, the province just released a high-level roadmap yesterday, which basically outlines what types of things they're going to be looking for prior to easing public health measures. So they're looking for things consistent 2 to 4 week decrease in the number of new cases, a decrease in the rate of cases that can't be traced to a particular source, a decrease in the number of new cases in hospitals, making sure they have sufficient healthcare capacity, right, including the number of ventilators and personal protective equipment, ramping up our capacity to ensure that at least 90% of new COVID-19 contacts are being traced by public health officials within 24 hours. So ramping up that capacity. Ongoing testing of suspected cases, especially of vulnerable populations, so that they can kind of detect new outbreaks quickly. And hopefully that expands beyond just suspected cases. I think we need to aim for broader testing across a representative sample of the population with, sample sizes in the thousands to pick up cases that may not be showing symptoms and get a good sense of what the spread actually is. And then also they're looking for a kind of a shift. They're thinking about a shift to new ways of testing and contact tracing to promote widespread tracking of cases. And there's opportunities to leverage cell phones and other technologies to do this, as a number of countries have done with a lot of success. But simultaneously, a lot of discussion and debate around data ownership and privacy and how to do that in an ethical and time-bound kind of way. Alternatively, we could just go old school and fund public health departments and volunteers to do in-person contact tracing. Likely the direction we need to go is probably some combination of the two. And as they lift public health measures and resume economic activity, once these aforementioned things are in place, they're going to do so in 3 stages. Each of those stages will last between 2 and 4 weeks. And they're looking at things like, which businesses can immediately meet or modify their operations while adhering to public health guidance, using things like curbside pickup or delivery. Or, they'll start with opening some outdoor spaces like parks, allow for a greater number of individuals to attend certain events like funerals. Hospitals will start to offer scheduled non-urgent surgeries again. Then, if that goes smoothly without seeing any kind of resurgence, They'll look at opening different workplaces based on risk assessments and maybe some larger public gatherings. And then eventually, we move to all workplaces and further relax restrictions on other public gatherings. That said, I think the largest types of public gatherings like concerts and sporting events are likely to kind of remain off the table for the foreseeable future. The plan also acknowledges the need to minimize outbreaks in special settings like nursing homes, which is definitely a weak spot in Canada right now. But efforts finally seem to be underway to try and address what up to now has really been a failure of our system to protect our elders. So stopping long-term care staff from working in multiple facilities as a way to slow the spread of the virus is certainly one step that has helped, but we'll need to continue limiting visits with seniors and ensuring other prevention measures stay in place for some time. They also obviously mentioned the reopening of schools, but haven't provided a lot of detail at this point. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that while kids seem to be less susceptible to COVID-19, they're also very well equipped to transmit it. So we're going to have to be careful with that one. And if I'm honest, I'm really not holding my breath in terms of my kids going back to during this current school year anyways. During all of these phases, the plan is to maintain physical distancing and hand washing, along with self-isolation when experiencing symptoms. The plan also encourages continuing remote work arrangements where those are feasible. And we won't move from one stage to the next if there's any signs of a resurgence in cases. This will obviously continue to get more detailed and nuanced as time goes on. They'll start to fill in details. You can, go fishing or camping or open a golf course, et cetera, et cetera. I know people wanted to see dates and perhaps something more concrete. But for now, I think it's an appropriate acknowledgement that there's uncertainty in what lies ahead, and it places the right kind of emphasis on ensuring we have the right public health resources in place to reopen the economy. So this roadmap also seems to be in line with the requirements for reopening suggested by the World Health Organization, which additionally notes the importance of managing the risks of importing cases from outside the country, as well as ensuring local communities are educated and engaged and empowered to adjust to our new normal. And we're doing both of these things for the most part pretty well in Ontario and Canada. I think we're still a ways out from reopening the border to non-Canadians, but what's certain is that before we do, being able to screen potential visitors with point of care testing at airports, making it easier to identify carriers and having functioning systems to quarantine people for 14 days will likely have to be in place before we do that. And we'll likely also see more targeted travel restrictions for visitors from specific countries, depending on how they're managing the virus. But this, of course, can get politically messy. One can only imagine how that might look with regard to our neighbors to the south, right? No matter what, I think we're going to have to accept, like we did with security protocols after 9/11, that there are going to be changes to the way that we travel. So overall, I think the thing we have to realize is that it takes longer for the curve to go down than it does for it to come up. And so control measures really have to be lifted more like a dimmer switch rather than a flick switch, and it's a combination of testing, isolation, tracing, and continued physical distancing that's likely to enable control of COVID-19 with the least disruption. I also think that no matter what decisions we make politically or from a public health perspective, amongst the biggest unknowns of this kind of post-lockdown period will be how each individual chooses to behave, right? Not everyone's going to immediately resume the activities that are allowed. It will, it'll take a lot of good communication so that people understand what the risks are and feel comfortable going back to work or school. And that too will be a gradual process, with some people immediately doing everything that's allowed and others taking it more slowly. Some employers will probably take a number of months before they require workers to come back. And some people will want the restrictions lifted more rapidly and may choose to, even break the rules, right? Which will put people at risk. So good communication and compliance, I think, will be key. Another important part of this is that I think we need to be wary of arguments that, pit health versus the economy. There's a lot of good analysis that in the long run, if we end up with uncontrolled spread of COVID, the economy will take a much, much longer time to recover. And we already know that you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy workforce. We have to take it to heart that the path back to a functional economy really runs through sound public health measures. And so I guess just to kind of wrap this up, I started by mentioning that in the longer term, the best chances we have of beating this pandemic is to develop a vaccine and vaccinate most of the population. The fact is that while treatments can save lives, vaccines save populations. And that's why they're such a critical part of the public health toolkit. And that's because with vaccines, you can stop the transmission chain, right? So if you can vaccinate and make sure people become non-transmitters, where they don't develop the viral load sufficient enough to pass on the virus, then you can get that herd immunity effect. In other words, the resistance to the spread of a contagious disease within a population that results when enough individuals have immunity. And let me just say here that, this whole notion of letting the disease spread through the population until people acquire natural immunity is just not a viable option, right? It would mean millions of unnecessary deaths and is inhumane in countless ways. This is something that was being floated in the UK for some time, and the notion received a lot of backlash, and rightfully so. I think somebody noted that this strategy should have actually just been called pandemic cleansing. So vaccination is really our only viable route to herd immunity in this case. And historically, vaccines have saved more lives than any other tool in history. Smallpox, which used to kill millions of people every year, was eradicated with a vaccine. And they've played a key role in reducing childhood deaths from, I think it was like 10 million per year in 2000 to less than 5 million per year today. And with regard to the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, we're really seeing an unprecedented level of scientific collaboration taking place around the world right now. This is an area that we're very kind of engaged in from a research standpoint, in just kind of monitoring the processes around getting a vaccine out. So as an example, Chinese scientists published the genetic sequence for the virus on January 10th. And scientists from all over the world were able to start analyzing that sequence almost immediately that Friday. And by Monday, there were teams of researchers who had already isolated and designed potential candidate antigens for the vaccine. Today, according to the WHO, there are already 5 vaccine candidates in clinical evaluation. That means either phase 1 or 2 trials, and another approximately 71 candidate vaccines in preclinical evaluation, which means they haven't yet started phase 1 trials. And just to give you a sense of what that whole process looks like, we start with making a candidate vaccine, testing it in animals, right? These are preclinical stages. Then we have safety and testing in small numbers of humans. This is phase 1. Safety and efficacy testing in medium numbers of people. That's phase 2. And then safety and efficacy testing in large numbers of people, and that's phase 3. And finally, then you have regulatory approval and building manufacturing while registering the vaccine in every country. Now, unfortunately, this whole development process to get a vaccine against a new disease takes well over 5 years and typically even longer. So developing a vaccine for COVID in 12 to 18 months or from 18 to 24 months, which we believe is doable, would be a historic event in a number of ways. Many of these vaccine approaches will fail because they won't generate a strong enough immune response to provide protection, particularly in older people whose immune systems typically don't respond as well to vaccines. And so a number of candidates need to be funded so that they can advance at full speed, so that we can double down on the best bets and maximize the chances of finding a few winners. The goal is really to pick the one or two best constructs and vaccinate the entire world. That's like 7 billion doses if it's a single dose vaccine, and 14 billion if it's a double dose vaccine. And because of the rush to get them, the scale of the manufacturing needs to be like nothing we've ever seen, and we'll probably have to involve multiple companies and facilities, around the world. And the issue of safety is obviously another very important factor. So regulators worldwide have to work together to decide how large the safety database needs to be to approve a COVID-19 vaccine. And I guess the final point to make here is that equitable vaccine distribution is essential to achieving herd immunity, right? So at least for the first 8 to 12 months after a vaccine becomes available, it's likely that there's going to be only a limited supply to meet global demand. So there needs to be a global agreement on allocating stocks to countries around the world. Vaccines and antivirals can't just be sold to the highest bidder. If that were to happen, the result will be political tensions like what we're currently experiencing over allocation of personal protective equipment and ventilators and test kits. So these products need to be treated, as global public goods, and they need to be available and affordable for people who are at the heart of the outbreak and in the greatest need. Those are, frontline health workers, countries that are experiencing the brunt of the pandemic at that time, etc. Right? Not only is this approach to distribution the right thing to do, I think it's also the right strategy for cutting transmission and preventing future epidemics or future pandemics. In general, we're really going to have to focus on low and middle income countries where we already know there are challenges with supply chains, access to vaccination, civil registration and formal identification, limited health funding, weaker health systems. So global coordination obviously will be key to this, and that's one area of research that we're very involved in.
So you mentioned the supply of vaccines for low and middle